Lillian Talbot had written 32 letters filled with lies, and as the train carried her westward through the sun-scorched plains of Kansas in the spring of 1882, she finally allowed herself to wonder what kind of man would be standing on that platform waiting to meet a woman who did not exist. The letter that had started everything was tucked inside her dress, pressed flat against her ribs, as if she needed to feel its edges the way a person presses a bruise just to confirm the pain is real. She had written it in a boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, hunched over a single candle with a borrowed pen, after scanning the matrimonial column in the Cincinnati Enquirer and finding a small, unassuming advertisement that read, "Rancher in Coldwater Creek, Kansas Territory seeks honest and capable woman for correspondence and possible matrimony. Must be willing to relocate. Respond to David Barker, General Post, Coldwater Creek. Honest and capable." She had underlined those two words with her fingernail, not her pen, and then she had laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. What she had written back was this: that her name was Lillian Talbot, which was true, and that she was 24 years old, which was also true, and that she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant in Cincinnati who had recently passed away and left her well situated in the world, which was entirely and completely false. She was the daughter of a man who had drunk himself into an early grave 3 years prior and left her with a pile of debts and a reputation as the girl whose father had embarrassed himself in front of half the town on more than one occasion. She had told David Barker that she was accomplished in the domestic arts. She could cook and sew and manage a household. She had told him that her late father had kept horses and that she was therefore unafraid of ranch life. She had told him she was educated, which was partially true. She had attended the local schoolhouse until she was 14, and she had told him she was healthy and strong and of pleasant disposition, which was true enough when circumstances permitted. What she had not told him was that she had spent the last 3 years working in a laundry on the eastern side of Cincinnati, where the steam had reddened her hands and the hours had worn her thin, and that she had taken in extra mending on nights when the rent came due, and that she owned precisely 2 dresses, one of which was currently on her back, and the other of which was folded in the battered leather satchel above her head on the luggage shelf. She had not told him that she had no family left, no connections, no social standing, and no real reason for any man to consider her a suitable wife, except perhaps the fact that she was still standing when a good many people in her position would not have been. And she had not told him what she looked like. This had been deliberate, because the matrimonial letters she had read from other women were full of descriptions of fair complexions and gentle eyes and graceful forms, and Lillian knew herself to be something rather different from that ideal. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair that refused to curl properly and eyes the color of creek water after rain, and she had the hands of a laundress and the posture of someone who had spent years trying to take up as little space as possible. She was not the kind of woman who appeared in romantic illustrations. She was the kind of woman who got things done. But she had kept writing those letters, and he had kept writing back, and somewhere between the first exchange and the 32nd, something had happened that she had not planned for at all. She had come to look forward to his letters more than anything else in her life. David Barker wrote the way a man thinks when he is alone on a wide stretch of land, and has learned to be honest with himself, because there is no one around to perform for. He wrote about the ranch in Coldwater Creek, the cattle and the horses, and the way the sky looked in the mornings when the light came low and flat across the grassland. He wrote about his neighbor, a stubborn old man named Harlan Webb who kept letting his fence lines drift and whose cows regularly ended up in David's north pasture. He wrote about the town, which had a general store and a saloon and a church that was also used as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a new telegraph office that had opened up last year and which the town was very proud of. He wrote about loneliness, not in a self-pitying way, but in the honest, matter-of-fact way of a man who looks around at his life and finds it decent but missing something essential. He had built a house with 3 rooms and a proper kitchen and a covered porch, and he had planted a small kitchen garden in the spring. And when he wrote about those things, he also wrote about the space in them that was unfilled. The second chair at the kitchen table that had never been used. The hooks by the door where someone else's coat might hang someday. He was 30 years old. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee after the war years had left the East feeling like a country that was finished with itself, and he had found in the grasslands something that felt like a beginning. He had worked hard and saved carefully and built the ranch from almost nothing, and he was proud of it without being boastful about it, and that restraint came through in every letter he wrote. Lillian had concluded somewhere around letter number 12, a genuinely good man, which was exactly why she kept lying to him. Because a genuinely good man deserved better than a Cincinnati laundress with red hands and no dowry, and a father who had died in a ditch behind McGready's saloon. A genuinely good man deserved the woman she was describing in her letters, capable and educated and pleasantly situated in the world. And so, she kept writing that woman into existence, letter by letter, and she told herself she was doing him a kindness by making the correspondence worthwhile until he found someone real. Except that he had asked her to come. He had written the proposal in letter 29 with the same careful, unadorned honesty that characterized everything he wrote. He said he had given the matter considerable thought, and that he had come to believe that he and Lillian would suit each other well, and that he was not a man who made such invitations lightly, and that he understood it was a great thing to ask of a woman, to leave everything she knew and travel to a place she had never seen to make a life with a man she had never met. But he thought the life he was offering was a good one, and he thought she was a good woman, and he wanted to know if she would come. She should have said no. She should have confessed the truth in letter 30 and ended the correspondence with some dignity. She should have done a great many things. Instead, she had written back that she would come in May. And then she had written one more letter, letter 32, in which she had finally said something almost true. She had said that she was looking forward to meeting him very much, and that she hoped he would not be disappointed, and that she believed a person could build something real even when they started from very little, and that she was not afraid of hard work. She had not meant it as a confession. But reading it back, she thought that perhaps some part of her had been trying to tell him something after all. The train rattled on, and the plains of Kansas opened up around her like an enormous, indifferent gift. The town of Coldwater Creek announced itself first by a water tower, and then by a cluster of low wooden buildings baking in the afternoon sun. The platform was unpainted lumber, and the station itself was barely larger than a generous shed, and there were 3 people standing on it when the train groaned to a stop in a cloud of steam and noise. Lillian sat very still in her seat for a moment. Then she picked up her satchel, straightened her spine, and walked toward the door of the car. She stepped down onto the platform and stood in the light, and she made herself look. There were 2 older men talking near the far end, clearly not there for her. And then there was a man standing alone in the middle of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in his fingers the way a person does when they are nervous and are trying not to show it. He was tall, somewhat taller than she had imagined, with dark brown hair and a strong, sun-weathered face that was not handsome in any conventional sense, but was the kind of face you would trust. He was wearing a plain work shirt and a good pair of trousers and boots that had been polished recently. He had the build of a man who worked outdoors every day, broad through the shoulders and straight through the back, and his hands around the brim of his hat were large and capable. He was looking at her. She had started toward him because there was nothing else to do, and she was close enough to see his expression properly when he spoke, and what he said was not what she expected at all. He said, "Miss Talbot, I'm David Barker," and then without any preamble or particular drama he said, "I already know." She stopped walking. The platform was hot, and the steam from the train still drifted around them, and somewhere down the street, a horse shifted its weight and a door swung on a hinge. "I beg your pardon," she said, because she needed to hear it again. "I know you weren't entirely truthful in your letters," he said. He was still holding his hat. His voice was quiet and level, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. "I figured it out a while back. I'm not angry about it. I just didn't want you to step off this train and spend the first 5 minutes trying to figure out when to tell me." Lillian stared at him. She had prepared on the long train journey for a great many scenarios. She had prepared for him to be disappointed. She had prepared for him to be cold or formal or politely distant. She had prepared at her most anxious moments for him to simply not be there. She had not prepared for this. "How?" she said. He put his hat back on his head, tilting it slightly against the afternoon glare. "The postmark on your letters said Cincinnati. In your letters you mentioned your father's warehouse was near the river, and I know Cincinnati well enough to know the river district. But you also mentioned walking to the lending library to return a book, and the lending library in Cincinnati isn't near the river district. It's near the residential blocks on the north side." He paused. A prosperous merchant's daughter with a warehouse near the river wouldn't be walking to the library. She'd be sending someone. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "There were other things," he said, not unkindly. "Small things. The kind of details that slip when a person is writing quickly or forgetting which version they wrote down last. I'm not saying it to embarrass you. I'm just saying I'm not an easy man to fool for 32 letters." "You counted," she said. "I kept every one of them." He said it simply, without any implication except the plain truth of it. "Miss Talbot, I don't know what your real circumstances are, and I'm not going to ask you to stand on a train platform in the heat and explain yourself. But I want you to know that I'm not standing here out of obligation or because I already paid for the train ticket, which I did, but that's not the reason." He looked at her steadily. "I'm standing here because the woman who wrote those letters is someone I want to know, whatever the true details of her life turn out to be." There was a long silence. Then Lillian said, "I worked in a laundry," and she said it plainly, the way you say a thing when you have decided to stop being ashamed of it. "For 3 years. My father died with more debts than assets, and I've been supporting myself since I was 21. I have 2 dresses and no property and no family connections worth mentioning, and I can cook plain food but I can't make pastry, and I've never actually been on a horse in my life." He absorbed this. Then he said, "Can you learn? To make pastry or to ride?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was near one. "Either, probably," she said. "I'm not afraid of trying things." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then we're starting from an honest place," he said. "That's more than most people manage." He looked at her satchel. "Is that everything you brought?" "Yes." He took it from her hand without asking permission, which should have felt presumptuous, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I've got a wagon outside. It's about 4 miles to the ranch. I thought we might stop at the general store first if you need anything for the house." "I don't want to be a burden on your expenses," she said. "You're going to be my wife," he said. "That's not a burden, that's a partnership." He said it matter-of-factly, as if they had already agreed on this and merely needed to get on with it. She followed him off the platform and out into the dust and sun of Coldwater Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and she thought that she had come all this way prepared to be found out and sent back, and instead she had been found out and asked to stay, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that except walk forward. The wagon was a plain buckboard with a good horse in the traces, a bay mare with a calm eye, and David helped Lillian up onto the bench with a hand under her elbow that was brief and steady and impersonal. He went around to the other side and climbed up and took the reins, and they sat side by side in the afternoon sun, and he did not speak right away, and she did not either, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. The town was small but lively in the particular way of frontier towns, which is to say that everything about it was slightly temporary looking. The buildings faced with false fronts to make them seem taller, the street unpaved and muddy in the low spots where the spring rains had pooled. There was a blacksmith shop with the ring of hammer on iron coming from inside it. There was a hotel with a painted sign that said Coldwater Creek Hotel and dining in letters that had faded since they were painted. There were women on the boardwalks in calico dresses and men in work clothes, and the general air of a place that was busy being built. They stopped at the general store, a long, low building that smelled of sawdust and dried beans and axle grease, and the particular complex fragrance of a place that sells everything. The man behind the counter was called Hector Mays, a stocky man of 50 with a carefully trimmed mustache, who shook David's hand and looked at Lillian with frank and not unkind curiosity. "This is Lillian Talbot," David said. "She's come from Cincinnati." "Heard you were expecting company," Hector Mays said. He extended his hand to Lillian. "Welcome to Coldwater Creek, Miss Talbot. You'll find it's a good town once you know where things are." "Thank you," Lillian said. "I'm sure I'll get my bearings." "She'll need a few things," David said. He looked at Lillian. "Anything you see that you need." She walked the aisles carefully, aware of the cost of things and aware that she was, in some sense, being observed, and she chose with a practicality that she hoped communicated itself to David Barker as evidence that she was not a woman who spent recklessly. Thread, a bar of good soap, a pair of sturdy gloves for the garden, a small tin of baking powder. She held the baking powder for a moment, thinking of the pastry comment, and put it in her basket. David added to the pile without comment, a length of calico and a blue print that he placed on the counter with a look in her direction that was asking without asking. She touched it and said it was nice, and he kept it. He also bought flour and salt pork and dried beans, the staples of a working larder. When they were outside again with the goods loaded in the wagon bed, Lillian said, "Thank you for the fabric." "You'll need more than 2 dresses out here," he said practically. Then he glanced at her. "I wasn't trying to point that out as a criticism." "I know," she said. "I took it the way it was meant." He nodded, and they drove out of town toward the ranch. The land opened up around them in a way that Lillian found both frightening and beautiful, the grasslands rolling away on all sides under a sky that was larger and higher than any sky she had encountered before. In Cincinnati, the sky was framed by buildings and smoke, something you saw in pieces. Out here it was the whole ceiling of the world. The grass was green from spring rains, and there were wildflowers she did not know the names of scattered through it, and in the distance the prairie stretched on until it blurred into the horizon without interruption. It smelled of earth and grass, and the occasional sweet drift of something flowering nearby. "It's very large," she said. "You'll get used to it," he said. Then after a moment, "Or you won't. Some people never do. The ones who don't usually head back east within a season." She heard the question underneath that. "I'm not going back," she said. He looked sideways at her. "Why not?" She thought about this honestly, because he seemed to be a man who preferred honesty, and said, "Because there's nothing to go back to, and because I believe you are a decent man and this is a decent life, and I think I can be useful here." She paused. "And because I am very tired of being afraid of what comes next, and there is something about wide-open spaces that makes being afraid seem smaller." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good reason." The ranch came into view around a low rise, a house and a barn and several outbuildings, and a set of corrals with cattle visible beyond them. The house was solidly built of timber with a covered porch along the front, and there were new green shoots in the kitchen garden beside it, and a cottonwood tree at the corner that was just coming into leaf. It was not a beautiful house, but it was a serious house, the kind built by a man who intended to stay. "It's very good," Lillian said, and she meant it. He pulled the wagon around to the side and helped her down. He showed her through the house without ceremony, the kitchen with its iron stove and the 2 main rooms and the bedroom, and she noted with relief, and something more complicated than relief, that the house had been arranged with care. There was a curtain at the bedroom window. There was a rag rug on the kitchen floor. Whoever he was, David Barker was a man who paid attention to the small things that made a house livable. She set about putting the pantry goods away while he went to tend the horse, and by the time he came back she had the stove going and a pot of beans on, and the kitchen looked occupied in a way it clearly had not before. He stood in the doorway and looked at her at the stove, and something in his expression shifted and settled. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, "until we're properly married. There's a minister comes through town on Sundays." "That's 2 days away," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. "I appreciate it." "It's just the right thing," he said, and went out. She cooked the beans with the salt pork and made cornbread in the skillet, which she knew how to do. And when he came in from feeding the stock, they ate together at the kitchen table, and the empty second chair was not empty anymore. They talked, cautiously at first and then with more ease, about practical things, the cattle and the garden and the names of the neighbors and the workings of the ranch. He told her about the water situation, which was managed by a creek that ran along the east edge of the property and which had been reliable so far, and about the cattle count and the hay stores and the number of horses. She asked questions and he answered them directly, and by the time supper was over she knew more about ranching in Kansas than she had known that morning. Before he went back out to the barn, he paused at the door and said, "Lillian." It was the first time he had used her first name. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you came," he said, "whatever the circumstances." She held that statement carefully, the way you hold something fragile. "I'm glad too," she said. "I think." He almost smiled again. "Fair enough," he said, and went out. She lay in the bed that night under a quilt that had been made by hands she did not know, in a house that was not yet hers, in a darkness that was more complete and more quiet than anything she had known in the city. And she thought about a man who had figured out that she was lying and had come to the train anyway. She thought about the way he had said he already knew, and the way he had taken her satchel, and the way he had looked standing at the stove in the doorway of his kitchen with something settling in his expression. She had come expecting to be found out and discarded. She had not expected to be found out and chosen. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept deeply. Sunday came around and the minister, a young man named Reverend Cole who rode a circuit through 4 towns and seemed simultaneously exhausted and indestructibly cheerful, arrived in Coldwater Creek to conduct services in the church schoolhouse. David had asked Hector Mays at the general store and a woman named Martha Webb, who was married to the difficult neighbor, to serve as witnesses, and Lillian wore her better dress and pinned her hair up properly and stood beside David Barker in front of Reverend Cole and made her promises. She made them as honestly as she could, which meant she made them as a woman who had a great deal to learn and a great deal to prove and a genuine wish to do both. The ceremony was short and practical. When it was over, David put his hand on hers briefly and she felt the warmth of it, and Martha Webb, who was a round-faced woman of about 45 with kind eyes, embraced Lillian with a sincerity that made Lillian's throat tighten unexpectedly. "You'll want friends out here," Martha said quietly. "I'm just across the north field. Come whenever you need to." "Thank you," Lillian said, and meant it completely. There was a small gathering afterward in the church that served as a wedding supper, because that was how things were done in small frontier towns, and Lillian met more of the people of Coldwater Creek. There was a man named George Finch who ran the blacksmith shop, and his wife Clara, who was very young and very pregnant with their second child. There was the postmaster, a thin man named Edgar Howell, who shook Lillian's hand with great formality. There was a woman named Dot Crane who ran the hotel dining room and who looked Lillian over with the frank appraisal of a woman who has seen all kinds come through and was in the process of deciding what kind this was. By the end of the evening, Lillian had the sense that this was a town that would take you in if you worked for it. She and David drove back to the ranch in the cooling evening, and the sky was remarkable, full of color and spread wide from horizon to horizon. And for the first time in a very long time, Lillian felt something that was not anxiety or exhaustion, but something quieter and more solid than either. "You were nervous at the ceremony," David said. "Yes," she said. "You didn't show it. I've had practice at not showing things." He looked at the road ahead. "You can stop that now," he said. "You don't have to manage how you appear with me." She turned to look at him. The evening light was in his face and he was looking at the road, and she thought that he was the most uncomplicated person she had ever met, in the sense that he said what he meant and meant what he said, and that this quality was rarer and more valuable than she had understood before she met someone who had it. "It's a difficult habit to break," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be patient." They came home to the ranch in the last of the light, and the cottonwood tree was a dark shape against the gold sky, and the house had a light burning in the kitchen window from the lamp she had left on, and it looked inhabited and warm. "This is mine now," she thought, and the thought felt extraordinary and frightening and right. The weeks that followed were full of work and learning. Lillian was not afraid of work, which was the most important thing, and she applied herself to the ranch the way she had applied herself to the laundry, which was to say completely and without complaint, and with a constant eye toward doing the thing better than she had done it the day before. She learned to cook on the wood stove, which was different from city cooking, and she planted the kitchen garden with additional seeds she bought from Hector Mays and tended it carefully. She learned to churn butter and to preserve the early vegetables and to make the kind of plain, hearty food that sustained a man who worked 12 hours a day outdoors. She found that she could make bread very well, which was a satisfaction, and that the pastry question was resolvable with practice and proper lard. She learned to ride, which was more difficult and more humbling than she expected. David taught her on a patient old gelding named Moses, and the first lessons were more falling off than staying on, but she persisted with the same stubbornness she had applied to everything else in her life, and after 3 weeks she could walk and trot without disaster, and by the end of the month she could canter well enough to be useful. "You're a natural," David said one afternoon, watching her come in from a short solo ride around the near pasture. "I'm not a natural," she said, sliding down from Moses with rather more grace than she had managed a month ago. "I just don't give up." "That's the same thing out here," he said. She found that she liked the horses. She liked Moses specifically, who had the placid, wise temperament of an animal that has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. And she liked the bay mare that pulled the wagon, whose name was Cora, and who had strong opinions about how fast she ought to be asked to walk. She learned their personalities and their preferences and their small quirks, and she found that the early mornings in the barn had a particular quality of peace that she treasured. The relationship between her and David developed with the same care and practicality that characterized everything he did. They were comfortable with each other from the beginning, which was not romance exactly, but was something on which romance could be built. The comfort of two people who have decided to be honest with each other and who find, in that honesty, a reliability that feels like ground under their feet. He made her laugh, which she had not expected. He had a dry, quiet humor that appeared without warning in ordinary moments, a remark about old Harlan Webb's wandering cattle, an observation about the behavior of the barn cat, a story told with perfect deadpan delivery about the time he had tried to fix his own roof and fallen through it. She laughed more in the first month on the ranch than she had in the 3 years of the laundry. She told him about the laundry, one evening when they were sitting on the covered porch in the cooling air after supper. She told him about the steam and the long hours and the woman she had worked beside for 2 years, a widow named Frances Briggs who had had a mean laugh and a kind heart, and who had taught Lillian to defend herself in arguments. She told him about the boarding house and the room she had shared with another woman, and the way the rent was always slightly more than was comfortable. She told him about her father, which was harder, but she told it plainly, a man who had loved her in his way but who had been defeated by his own appetites and had left her to manage the wreckage of his defeat. David listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You've been carrying a lot alone." "Most people do," she said. "I just didn't want to make it seem like an excuse." "It's not an excuse," he said. "It's the truth of where you came from." "There's a difference." She looked at him in the evening light. "You're very good at that," she said. "At what?" at making a distinction between truth and judgment. Most people fold them together. He considered this. My father used to say that the facts of a thing and what you think of the facts are separate questions, he said. He wasn't a philosophical man, but that was a useful thing he said. She asked about his father, and he told her about Tennessee, about a farm in the foothills and a family that was large and loud and deeply ordinary. He had 3 brothers and a sister, and his parents were both still living, and he wrote to them twice a year, and they wrote back with the particulars of a world that felt very distant from the Kansas plains. He had come west because the oldest son inherits and he was the second son, and there was not room enough on the Tennessee farm for 2 men trying to be the man of it. He said this without bitterness. Do you miss it? She asked. The family. Sometimes, he said. Around Christmas mostly, but I made something here that's mine and I don't think I'd trade it. She nodded. She understood that. There was a quality in those early evening conversations on the porch, in the blue dark of the spring nights with the coyotes calling somewhere in the distance, and the stars coming out overhead in numbers she had never seen, that she recognized later as the thing she had been looking for in all those letters. Not information, not the facts of a person's life, but the sense of being known, the particular intimacy of sharing the true details of yourself with someone who receives them without flinching. It was on a Thursday evening in June, about 6 weeks after her arrival, when the nature of things between them changed. They had eaten supper and she had been washing up, and he was sitting at the table with his account book doing the calculations of the week's work, and she turned from the sink and found him watching her with an expression that was different from his usual expression, which was calm and direct. This expression had something in it that was careful, the expression of a man who has something to say and is choosing how to say it. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and waited. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want to say it once clearly so you know where I stand. All right, she said. He closed the account book. When I wrote that advertisement and started the correspondence, I was looking for a practical arrangement, a capable woman who could be a partner in the work here and a companion at the end of it. He paused. What I was not expecting, and what I should probably have seen coming if I'd been paying closer attention, was that I was going to come to care for you the way I do. She sat down across from him. I'm not just saying this is a practical arrangement anymore, he said. I want you to know that. I care about you, Lillian. Not the woman in the letters, although I thought she was remarkable, and not the version of yourself you were trying to present. You. The actual woman who learned to ride Moses and planted twice as many vegetables as the garden could need and stayed up until midnight putting up preserves because you were determined to finish the batch. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that because I think you're still waiting for the moment when it turns out this wasn't real, and I want to tell you it is. Her throat had gone tight in the way it did when something mattered more than she had prepared for it to. I'm not used to people choosing me, she said, and her voice was quiet and a little rough at the edges. I mean, choosing me specifically. Not because they needed something from me or because I was useful, but because, she stopped. Because of who you are, he said. Yes. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and this time it was not brief and impersonal the way it had been at the wedding. It was deliberate and warm, and it stayed. I'm choosing you, he said. I chose you at the train platform. I choose you now. I expect to keep choosing you. She turned her hand over and held his, and she looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she thought about 32 letters and the long train journey across the plains and the moment he had said he already knew, and she thought that all of it, all the lies and the fear and the exhaustion and the hoping, had somehow led to this kitchen and this man and this hand in hers. I care about you too, she said. Very much. I think I have since around letter number 14, though I told myself I was being foolish. You weren't being foolish, he said. No, she agreed. I wasn't. He brought her hand up and held it against the side of his jaw for a moment, a gesture so simple and so sincere that it undid something in her chest that had been wound tight for a long time. Then he said quietly, We're going to be all right, Lillian. I know, she said, and for the first time since she could remember, she believed it completely. What followed was a summer of real happiness, which is to say a happiness grounded in work and weather, and the particular textures of ordinary days, and which was all the more valuable for being real and earned. The ranch work was constant and demanding, and she threw herself into it alongside David with a commitment that startled even herself. She had always worked hard because she had to. Here, she worked hard because it was hers, because every row she planted and every fence post she helped set, and every calf she watched come into the world was part of a life that belonged to her, and that belonging felt like something she had been hungry for without knowing what the hunger was. David was an excellent teacher in the practical things and a patient one in the personal things. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds and the wind, which plants in the pasture the cattle preferred and which they avoided, how to treat the minor ailments of livestock, and which neighbors could be relied upon and which needed managing. He showed her things with the same matter-of-fact directness with which he did everything, and she absorbed them all with the attentiveness of someone who understands that knowledge is a form of safety. Martha Webb became a true friend. She came over on Tuesdays with her mending basket and sat on the porch with Lillian, and they talked for hours. And Martha knew everyone in the county and the history of the town, and the small dramas and alliances that made up the social world of Coldwater Creek. She was funny and sharp and generous, and she had been lonely herself out on the Webb Ranch with Harlan, who was a decent man but not a talkative one, and she took to Lillian's company with an enthusiasm that was mutual. Through Martha, Lillian became part of the church quilting circle, which met on the first Friday of each month, and which was less about quilting than about the exchange of information and solidarity that women in isolated places need to survive. There was Clara Finch, whose baby was born in July, a boy named Thomas who was enormous and loud, and whom everyone agreed had his father's nose. There was Dot Crane from the hotel, who was a widow and ran her establishment with an iron hand and a sharp tongue, and a surprisingly warm heart underneath both. There was a younger woman, Nora Bright, who had come from Missouri 3 years ago, and whose husband had a homestead claim on the other side of the creek, and who had the kind of restless intelligence that did not always find enough to occupy it in frontier life, and who was visibly delighted to have Lillian to talk to. In August, something happened that tested the ground she had built. A letter arrived from Cincinnati. It was addressed to Miss Lillian Talbot, which was no longer her correct name, and it was from a man named Archibald Swan, who had been one of her father's creditors. The letter informed her, in the clipped language of a man who has learned to communicate through correspondence to people who owe him money, that the estate of the late Thomas Talbot had been reevaluated, and that certain outstanding amounts were still considered recoverable, and that as the eldest and only surviving child of Thomas Talbot, Lillian was being asked to consider her responsibility in the matter. The amount named was $214. She sat with the letter for the rest of the afternoon, and she did not show it to David when he came in for supper, and she was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet, and he noticed. After supper he said, "What is it?" She got up and brought the letter from where she had folded it inside her apron pocket and gave it to him and sat back down. He read it. He set it on the table. He was quiet for a moment. "This is from before you came here," he said. "Yes. It's not your debt." "He was my father." "That doesn't make his debts yours under the law," David said. "You weren't a signatory to any obligation. Swan knows that. He's trying to collect from the easiest person available." "I know that," she said. "I'm not going to pay it, She stopped. "I'm not used to having it be someone else's concern, too. I've been sorting things like this alone for 3 years, and it is a strange feeling to have someone else read the letter." He looked at her. "Is it a bad feeling or a good one?" She thought about it. "Good," she said. "Uncomfortably good." "I'll write back to Mr. Swan," he said, "and explain the legal situation clearly. If he persists, there's a lawyer in Wichita who handles these matters." "You don't have to. You are my wife," he said, with a simplicity that closed the matter. "What concerns you concerns me. "That's not a burden, Lillian. It's the point." She picked up the letter and folded it again and put it back in her pocket, and she did not say anything else about it, but she reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, and he turned it and held hers for a moment before he went back to his supper. He wrote to Archibald Swan. Mr. Swan did not write again. Autumn came and brought with it the cattle drive, which was the major business of the ranching year. David drove his cattle to the railhead at Dodge City in the company of two other local ranchers, a man named Cal Patterson and a man named Roy Decker, and he was gone for 3 weeks. Lillian managed the ranch alone. She had not anticipated how competent she would feel doing it, or how lonely. The competence came from everything she had learned over the summer: the horse care, the daily routines of the place, the management of the small things that needed doing continuously. The loneliness was new, or rather not new but differently textured than the loneliness of Cincinnati, because in Cincinnati she had been alone in a crowd, and here she was alone in the landscape, and the landscape was very large and very quiet. Martha came twice a week. That helped enormously. Nora Bright rode over one morning with news that a small party of Osage people had been seen passing through the western edge of the county, moving south. She said it in a tone that expected Lillian to be alarmed, and Lillian thought about what she knew, which was not much, and said simply that she hoped they traveled safely, which caused Nora to look at her with some surprise. There were, Lillian had come to understand, a great many injustices operating in the Kansas territory that people in the towns spoke of in ways that revealed how completely they had accepted those injustices as the natural order. The Osage and the Kaw and the other peoples of the plains had been moved from their territories through treaties that were consistently broken by the government that had written them, pushed onto reservations, and onto the margins of the land they had known for generations. She had read enough about this in Cincinnati, in those newspapers and pamphlets that circulated among people who thought about such things, to understand that the settlement of the West was not simply a story of hardy pioneers and empty land. There was nothing empty about it. There had been people here, living a life that was not hers and not David's to take. She could not undo that. She could only try to see it clearly. When David came back from the cattle drive, tanned and tired and carrying a considerably heavier money belt than he had left with, she told him what she thought about it. They were sitting on the porch on his first evening home, and the stars were out in their thousands, and she said it simply, that she thought the way the Osage people had been treated in Kansas was wrong, and that she thought a great many people chose not to see it, and that she did not want to be one of those people. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've thought about it too. The land I own wasn't purchased from the people who used it first. It was purchased from the government, which is not the same thing." "No," she said, "it isn't. I don't know what the right thing to do with that understanding is," he said honestly. "I can't undo what was done, but I can try not to make it worse, and I can try to be honest about it." "That's a start," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they sat like that in the cooling night, and it was one of those ordinary moments that is somehow more significant than the dramatic ones. He had brought her a gift from Dodge City, which he produced from his coat pocket with the slight self-consciousness of a man who is not practiced at gift-giving. It was a small brooch made of silver with a blue stone in the center, modest and pretty, and he held it out to her and said it had caught his eye in a shop window and he thought she might like it. She held it in her palm and looked at it and then looked at him and said, "David," and he said, "It's not much," and she said, "It's exactly right," and she meant both the brooch and him entirely. She wore it on her best dress thereafter always, which he noticed, and which she knew he noticed, and which was its own kind of conversation. The winter came hard and cold, as Kansas winters do, and the ranch contracted into its indoor self. The days were shorter and the work was different, maintaining the animals through the cold, keeping the house warm, managing the stores they had put up through the summer and fall. They were inside together more, which meant they talked more, and the talk ranged widely across their history and their thoughts and their plans. And Lillian found that winter had its own kind of richness, the richness of being pressed close to the things and people that matter when the world outside is hostile. She read to him in the evenings. She had discovered, by borrowing from a small collection of books kept at the church, that David had had less formal schooling than she had, and that he was a man who loved stories but who read slowly and with effort, and that having her read aloud to him was a pleasure he had not previously had available to him. They went through Scott's Ivanhoe and then a collection of short stories, and then, at her suggestion, a book of natural history that had detailed illustrations of animals from around the world, which he found endlessly interesting. She fell more deeply in love with him during those winter evenings than at any other time, because they were evenings in which there was nothing to perform and nothing to prove, in which they were simply two people in a warm kitchen with lamplight and books and the stove and the cat, who had moved indoors for the winter and who had opinions about where she sat, which were her own opinions and not the cat's. In February she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, with the directness that she had brought to everything else. She said she was fairly certain and that she would be glad to have Martha confirm it, and that she thought he should know as soon as she did. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something move through his expression, something private and deep that she could not fully interpret, and then he got up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands and held them. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but that seems to be the normal way of it." He held her hands and looked at her and said, "I am very happy about this." "I can see that," she said. "Your face is doing something I haven't seen before." He laughed, a real laugh, and pulled her into his arms, and she held on, and he said into her hair, "A baby." "Lord, a baby," she agreed. Martha came the next day and confirmed it and spread the news to the quilting circle at the appropriate time, and the women of Coldwater Creek rallied around Lillian with the collective maternal energy of a community that takes the arrival of new life as a communal event. Clara Finch gave her a quantity of baby clothes that Thomas had outgrown. Martha started a new quilt. Dot Crane, who was unexpectedly sentimental about babies, produced a small carved wooden horse from somewhere and pressed it on Lillian with the insistence of a woman who will not be denied. Spring came again, and with it the mud and the new green and the particular energy of a world starting over. Lillian moved through the season with her expanding shape and her good health and her deep sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was a feeling she had not had for so much of her life that she was still slightly surprised to find it available. She and David had long conversations about the child, about names and about what they hoped, and about the world the child would inherit. These conversations ranged out from the practical into the philosophical, which was where she most liked them to go, and she found that David had been doing his own thinking about the world, about the injustices she had raised, and about the nature of the community they were part of, and about what it meant to build something good in a place that had been taken from others. He had, on one of his supply trips to town, gotten into a prolonged conversation with the postmaster about the Indian schools that were being proposed in the territory, schools that would take children from their families and make them into something other than what they were. He had come home troubled and had talked to Lillian about it for a long evening, and she had said what she thought, which was that a school that destroys a child's language and family is not education, but a form of violence, and he had agreed, and they had both felt the particular discomfort of people who benefit from a system they know to be wrong and who cannot entirely escape it, but who refuse to pretend it doesn't exist. "We can be part of making this place honest," she said. "We can raise our child to see things clearly and to act with decency. We can't undo everything that was done, but we can choose what we teach." "That seems right to me," he said. It was a June morning when she felt the first real labor pains, and David rode for Martha at a pace that had the bay mare winded and had Martha on her horse inside of 5 minutes. The labor was long, most of a day and well into the evening, and there were hours in which Lillian understood why women were afraid of this. But she had Martha's steady hands and Martha's steady voice telling her what to do, and David, who sat outside the bedroom door for the entirety of it, and who she could hear occasionally making quiet sounds of what was clearly profound anxiety. At 9 o'clock in the evening of a June day in 1883, a boy came into the world in the Barker Ranch house outside Coldwater Creek, Kansas, making his views on the subject known at considerable volume. He was healthy and large and had a full head of dark hair, and Martha put him in Lillian's arms and said, "There he is," with the satisfaction of a woman who has been part of bringing something good into the world. David came in when Martha called him, and he stood in the doorway looking at Lillian in the bed with the baby in her arms, and his face was undone in a way she had never seen before, stripped of its usual composure and careful management, open and raw and full of something so large it seemed to have no proper name. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at her and said, "Are you all right?" "I am very much all right," she said. "Come and meet your son." He held the baby with the careful, astonished attention of a man encountering something he had known was coming, but whose reality still exceeds preparation. The baby regarded him with the unfocused but oddly penetrating gaze of the very newly born. "Hello," David said to his son, in a voice so quiet and so tender that Lillian felt it somewhere behind her ribs. "James," she said. "I thought James if you agreed." "James," he said, testing it. "James Barker." He looked at her. "It's a good name." They named him James Thomas Barker, the Thomas for her father, which David suggested himself, which meant more to her than she could say. James was a baby of strong character and insistent demands, which Lillian found both exhausting and deeply entertaining. He had David's direct gaze and her stubbornness, and he was the absolute center of the household in the way that babies are, reorganizing everything around the fact of his existence. The ranch continued. The work continued. Lillian carried James in a sling while she worked in the garden, and he grew in the particular rapid way of well-fed, well-loved babies. The quilting circle, adapted to include a new baby present at every meeting, which Thomas Finch and James treated as an opportunity to observe each other with the grave attention of two small people working out the nature of the world. Edgar Howell, the postmaster, came by the ranch one afternoon in July with a letter that had been addressed oddly, and that he had held at the post office uncertain whether to deliver it. It was addressed to Mrs. David Barker, formerly Miss Lillian Talbot, Cincinnati, in a hand she recognized from years past as that of Frances Briggs, her old colleague from the laundry. She read it with a complicated mixture of feelings. Frances had heard, through some chain of correspondence she did not explain, that Lillian had gone west and married. She was writing to say that she was glad and that the laundry had hired a new girl who was much more difficult to get along with than Lillian had ever been, and that she hoped Kansas was all Lillian had wanted it to be. The letter ended with, "I always thought you were someone who deserved better circumstances. I'm pleased you found them." Lillian wrote back that same evening with a full account of the ranch and the town and David and James, and she wrote it with a pleasure that came from having a life that was worth describing honestly. The second winter was easier than the first because they knew the rhythms of it, and James had the effect of making the dark months festive in a way that pure practicality never had. At Christmas, which they celebrated simply and warmly with Martha and Harlan Webb joining them for supper, and the Finch family coming for the afternoon with Thomas in his best clothes, Lillian looked around the table at the people gathered there and felt the specific quality of happiness that comes from something that has been built rather than simply found. She caught David's eye across the table, and he looked at her with that quiet, attentive expression that she had come to know as his expression for her specifically, the look he gave to nothing and no one else, and she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and there was an entire conversation in it that needed no words. Spring came again with the particular insistence of Kansas springs, explosive with green and loud with birds, and James took his first steps in the kitchen in April, falling forward toward his father's outstretched hands with the fearless commitment of a person who has not yet learned to doubt. David caught him and lifted him up and said, "There he is," in almost exactly the tones Martha had used when James was born, and Lillian stood in the kitchen doorway and laughed. In May of 1884, 2 years after her arrival on the train, Lillian sat on the covered porch in the evening and wrote a letter to her old boarding house acquaintance in Cincinnati, a woman named Helen Cross who had written inquiring after her. In the letter she described her life, the ranch and the horses and the garden, now considerably larger than the original kitchen plot, the town with its growing population and its new school that was now a proper school building separate from the church. She described David with the words of a woman who knows a person deeply and is not embarrassed to say so. She described James with the fond exasperation of a woman whose son has recently discovered that he can climb the fence of the lower pasture and has decided to do this as often as possible. She was about to describe the view from the porch, the wide golden light of the spring evening over the grassland, when David came and sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him and stopped writing for a moment. "What are you doing?" he said, looking at the letter. "Writing to Helen Cross in Cincinnati, telling her good things, very good things." He looked out at the evening land. There was something in his expression that she recognized as preparatory, the look of a man who has something to say and has been considering the when and the how. "What is it?" she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper and held it toward her. "Edgar Howell asked me to give you this. He said to tell you it came in on the morning delivery." She unfolded it. It was a brief telegram from Tennessee, from David's family, saying that his parents were hoping to come west in the autumn to see the ranch and meet their daughter-in-law and grandson, if the invitation was open. She looked at him. His expression was carefully neutral in the way it got when he was trying not to presume. "Is the invitation open?" she asked. "I would like them to come," he said. "My mother especially, but I wanted you to be comfortable with it. This is your home." She turned to look at him fully. "David, this is your home too, and they are your family, and I would very much like to meet the people who raise the kind of man who can figure out when someone is lying to him in a letter and decides to meet them at the train anyway." He laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and unguarded. "Write them back," she said. "Tell them to come." He kissed her then, there on the porch in the spring evening, with her letter half finished in her lap and James asleep inside and the coyotes just starting their distant commentary on the world's end, and it was the kind of kiss that had history in it and future in it and all the ordinary days between. When they broke apart he said, "I should have told you months ago." "Told me what?" "That this is the happiest I've ever been." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was low and gold, and the cottonwood at the corner of the house was full-leafed, and the barn was solid and real in the middle distance, and the land stretched away to the edge of the world. "Me too," she said. "I don't know how to account for it entirely. I came here prepared to be found wanting, and instead I found everything." "You found what you made," he said. "That's different from finding something that was waiting for you." "We made it," she said. "We made it," he agreed. The letter to Helen Cross got finished that night by lamplight, while David read and James slept and the ranch settled into its quiet nighttime self. In the final paragraph, Lillian wrote, "I came to Kansas believing I had to be someone else in order to be wanted, and I found instead that the truest thing I could offer was exactly the thing I had been most afraid to show. I found a man who looked past all my careful construction straight to whatever was real in me, and who chose that, and who keeps choosing it, and I have spent 2 years learning what it means to be loved without conditions, and I believe it is the thing that everything else is built upon. I am well, Helen. I am very well indeed." She folded the letter and addressed it and set it by the door to take to Edgar Howell in the morning, and she went to bed in the house that was hers and her husband's, in the room with the curtained window and the quilt that had been there before her, and she lay in the dark and listened to the breathing of the man beside her, steady and deep, the breathing of a man at peace with his life. She thought about the train. She thought about stepping down onto that hot platform in the afternoon glare, with her heart hammering and her hands cold inside her gloves, and the whole long weight of the lies she had written pressing down on her. She thought about him standing there with his hat turning in his hands and what he had said. He already knew, and he had come anyway. She had spent the first night on the ranch wondering what to do with being chosen. Now, 2 years later, she knew. You did everything. You brought yourself fully to the life that was offered to you, and you worked for it and tended it and told the truth about it, and you let yourself be loved by the person who had seen what you really were and had not looked away. It was not a complicated answer, but it was the true one. David's parents, Samuel and Ruth Barker, arrived in Coldwater Creek on a Thursday morning in late October, stepping off the same train on the same platform that Lillian had arrived on 2.5 years earlier. Ruth Barker was a small, energetic woman with David's eyes and her own set of very definite opinions about nearly everything. And Samuel Barker was a tall man going gray who was quiet in the way that David was quiet, which is to say that the quiet had weight to it. They came with a trunk of things from Tennessee, preserves and dried herbs, and a small bundle of letters from David's brothers and sister, and a hand-embroidered tablecloth that Ruth had made for the house. Lillian met them at the wagon with James on her hip and David beside her, and there was a moment at the beginning that was the moment of assessment, Ruth's eyes moving over Lillian with the frank and loving intelligence of a woman measuring the person who is keeping her son's heart. Then Ruth Barker stepped forward and put her arms around Lillian, tablecloth and all, and said, "My son wrote us that you were remarkable. I can see he wasn't stretching the truth." "He never does," Lillian said. Ruth leaned back and looked at her and laughed. "No, he does not. It was his most frustrating quality as a child." She transferred her attention immediately to James, who regarded his grandmother with the solemn assessment of a 17-month-old who has not yet decided whether this new person meets his standards, and then apparently decided she did, because he reached his arms toward her and went willingly, which made Ruth say something that was mostly just sound and which involved a great deal of joy. The visit lasted 2 weeks, and was one of the best 2 weeks Lillian had known. Ruth was a wealth of practical knowledge about preserving and cooking and household management, and she and Lillian spent hours at the kitchen table trading information like two people who have found a common language. She was also a woman who asked direct questions and expected honest answers, and Lillian found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind this at all, and that she answered Ruth's questions with the same directness she had learned from David, and that Ruth seemed to like her the better for it. Samuel Barker said fewer words in 2 weeks than most people said in an afternoon, but the words he said were good ones. On the second day he walked the ranch with David for 3 hours, and when he came in to supper he said to Lillian, "He's built something real here." And then, after a pause, "You both have." On the last evening before they left, Ruth found Lillian alone in the kitchen and said, quietly and without preamble, "I know things were not easy for you before you came here." Lillian said, "No, they weren't." "David told me," Ruth said. "Not all of it, but the general shape of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, you are my daughter, whatever came before, whatever you came from. You are my son's wife and the mother of my grandson, and you have made him happy in a way I was beginning to worry he would not find. And all of that matters a great deal more to me than the kind of details that look important in correspondence." Lillian felt her throat tighten. "That is a very generous thing to say." "It is not generosity," Ruth said. "It is just the truth." She patted Lillian's hand. "We will write more often. I intend to be very present in that grandson's life even from Tennessee." "He will know his grandmother well," Lillian promised. They left on a gray autumn morning, the wagon loaded, and Ruth held James for a long time before putting him back in Lillian's arms. And Samuel shook David's hand and then, to David's visible surprise, embraced him briefly and said something in his ear that Lillian did not catch, but which left David with the expression of a man who has been told something he needed to hear. After the wagon was out of sight down the road, David stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets and said, "My father told me he's proud of me." "Good," Lillian said. "He has never said that before." She reached up and touched the side of his face. He turned into her hand the way he always did, the gesture that had become theirs, specific and known. "Well," she said, "he should have been saying it for years." Winter came on again, and they moved through it with the settled competence of people who know their terrain. And the letters from Tennessee arrived with the new regularity that Ruth had promised, full of family news and observations and recipes and drawings that Ruth sent for James that showed animals in a way that was enthusiastic, if not precisely accurate. Lillian wrote back faithfully and at length, and she wrote to Frances Briggs in Cincinnati, and she wrote occasionally to Helen Cross, and the correspondence that had begun as a series of lies became, in its continuing form, one of the most honest things in her life. On a cold January evening with James in bed and the stove warm and snow working itself up to commit outside, David said from his chair with his book, "Do you miss Cincinnati?" She considered the question seriously. "I miss the library," she said, "and I miss Frances, and I miss, oh, the smell of the river in the spring, some things." She looked at him, but not the life, not the way it felt to live there. "How did it feel?" "Like I was waiting," she said. "Like I was in a room waiting for the actual thing to start." She paused. "This is the actual thing." He nodded slowly, the way he processed things he wanted to keep. "I'll take you to Wichita in the spring," he said, "if you want. It's not Cincinnati, but it has a library." She smiled. "I would very much like that." They went to Wichita in April, leaving James in Martha Webb's enthusiastic care, and it was the first time Lillian and David had been anywhere alone together since the wedding, and it had the quality of a second beginning, a chance to be with each other without the constant, gentle demand of James and the ranch. They stayed 2 nights in a hotel, and she went to the library and he met with the cattle buyers, and they ate supper at a proper restaurant, and they walked in the evening along the streets of a town that was larger and louder than Coldwater Creek and which felt, to Lillian, vivid and interesting precisely because she was not trying to survive in it. On the second evening they sat in the hotel room with the window open onto the street noise, and she said, "Thank you for bringing me. You don't have to thank me for things like this." "I want to," she said. "I want to thank you for all of it, actually. I came to Kansas thinking I was taking something I didn't deserve, and I understand now that I was just arriving, beginning. I was afraid you would be disappointed in the real me, and instead you were the first person in my memory who preferred it." He was sitting on the edge of the chair with his elbows on his knees in the way he sat when he was thinking seriously, and he looked at her and said, "I need to tell you something." "All right. When I wrote that advertisement," he said, "I nearly didn't. I wrote it, and then I left it on the desk for 4 days because it felt like a public admission of something I'd been avoiding, that I was lonely. The thing I'd built was insufficient by itself." He paused. "I'm not used to admitting insufficiency." "I know," she said, "and then I put it in with the post because I thought, if nothing else, it might lead to interesting correspondence." He looked at her. "I had no idea what it was going to lead to." "Neither did I," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that everything I said at the train platform and everything I said in the kitchen that first June and everything since, I mean all of it. You are not a practical arrangement to me. You are the person I built this life with. You are the reason the second chair at the kitchen table doesn't bother me anymore." She crossed the room and sat beside him on the edge of the chair, and he put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that while the street noise came through the window and the light went from gold to blue outside. "The second chair," she said. "I mentioned it in a letter once." "I know," she said. "I remember every letter, especially that one." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt his breath through her hair. And she thought about two people who had written to each other in the dark, both of them reaching across a distance for something they could not quite name and finding, improbably and against considerable odds, exactly what they needed. They came home to Coldwater Creek to find James in excellent health, and with the vocabulary of 3 new words, all of which Martha had taught him, and 2 of which were arguably not suitable for a 19-month-old. David received this news with the expression of a man trying not to laugh in front of Martha, and Lillian succeeded less well and laughed openly, and James regarded them both with the expression of a person who knows he has done something impressive but is not sure what. The summer of 1884 was a good summer. Good rains, good grass, a strong calf crop, the kitchen garden producing more than they could eat or put up, though Lillian managed to put up a great deal of it. Harlan Webb, next door, whose cattle had been transgressing the north fence line for 2 years, finally rebuilt the fence under pressure from his wife Martha and stopped being a topic of irritated conversation. The school in town hired its first full-time teacher, a young woman from Iowa named Miss Perkins, who was 20 years old and very serious, and who Lillian took an immediate liking to. There was a circuit judge who came through in July and held a session in the hotel dining room, and among the cases he heard was a land dispute that had been going on between Cal Patterson and a man named Luther Brody for 18 months. David gave testimony as a neighboring property owner and came home satisfied that the case had been resolved fairly, which was not always the result of such proceedings. James turned 2 in June and was commemorated with a small gathering on the porch, at which Thomas Finch attempted to eat an entire portion of Lillian's chocolate cake before his mother caught him, and Dot Crane produced a gift of a small stuffed horse, continuing what was apparently a personal policy of giving James horses in various forms. Martha gave him a carved wooden box with his initials on it, which he immediately tried to sit on rather than put things in, which was his right. In the fall of 1884, Lillian told David she was expecting their second child. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, plainly, and in the morning in the kitchen. He got up from the table and came to her and held her, and she felt him exhale against her hair, a long breath of something that was equal parts gratitude and wonder. "James will have a brother or a sister," he said. "One or the other," she agreed. They told James, who was 2½ and who received the information with a tolerant expression, and then said something about horses, which was where his interests primarily lay. The winter was mild by Kansas standards, which meant it was still very cold, but the deep blizzards held off until February, and by then the firewood situation was fully manageable. Ruth Barker's letters arrived more frequently now, full of questions about Lillian's health and suggestions about what Lillian should eat and what she should avoid, and David read these letters aloud in the evenings with a running commentary on his mother's opinions that made Lillian laugh until she had to ask him to stop. In March, with the land just beginning its thaw and the first timid green appearing at the edges of the creek, Lillian's second child arrived without the difficulty of the first. Martha was there again, calm and competent, and David was again on the other side of the door working himself into a state of quiet anxiety that was recognizable by the occasional creak of the floorboards. The baby was a girl. Small and dark-haired and completely certain of her own views from the first moments of her existence, she arrived at mid-morning and announced herself at length. David came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and at Lillian with the same undone expression he had worn when James was born, the same stripping away of his careful composure, the same largeness of feeling that had no simple name. "Hello," he said to his daughter. The same word he had said to James. There was something in the repetition that moved Lillian deeply. "Rose," she said. "I thought Rose." "Rose Barker," he said. He tried it again. "Rose, Ruth Rose Barker," she said. "If you agree." He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, gratitude and tenderness, and the particular warmth of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for. "I agree very much," he said. They wrote to Tennessee that evening, and Ruth Barker's response, when it came, was a single page that was mostly damp at one corner in a way that was not attributable to any known Kansas weather event. Rose grew in her own particular way, which was faster and more determinedly than James had, and with a greater apparent interest in the opinions of everyone around her, which she collected and assessed, and either adopted or set aside as her own judgment dictated. She was, from very early, her own person entirely. James, who had regarded her arrival with some skepticism initially, became her most devoted protector and companion by the time she could walk, a relationship that Lillian watched with a joy that was almost too large to hold. In the summer of 1885, when Rose was 4 months old and James was nearly 3, David proposed a thing that he had been considering for some time. He had spoken, he said, with some of the other ranchers in the county and with the minister and the teacher about establishing a small lending library in Coldwater Creek. It was a thing the town lacked and needed. He thought Lillian should run it. She stared at him. "Run it? You know books," he said. "You like them more than almost anyone I've ever met. You've been lending your own around the quilting circle for 2 years. You could organize it and manage the acquisitions and the lending. I don't have time to the ranch and the children. Nora Bright has said she'd help, and Clara Finch. It would be 2 afternoons a week to start." He looked at her carefully. "You told me you missed the library in Cincinnati. I can't bring Cincinnati here, but I can help build something equivalent." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are always doing that." "Doing what?" "Paying attention to what I say I want and then finding a way to give it to me." She shook her head. "You have been doing it since you put the blue calico on the counter at Hector May's." He tilted his head slightly. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is the loveliest thing. I'm just not used to it still." "You'll get used to it," he said, and there was a warmth in it that made her look away and then look back. "I'll run the library," she said. The Coldwater Creek Lending Library opened in a corner of the general store, given over for the purpose by a Hector Mays who had more civic pride than he usually let show, in September of 1885. Lillian ran it with Nora Bright and Clara Finch's help, and it started with 43 volumes, and a borrowing register she made herself, and a set of hand-lettered rules that she put up on a card above the shelves. On the first day, 3 people borrowed books, and one of them was Edgar Howell, the postmaster, who returned it within a week with a note saying it had been very good, "Thank you." Miss Perkins, the schoolteacher, brought her pupils in on a Wednesday afternoon to look at the library, and Lillian talked to them about the books and about reading, and about the particular power of a story to carry a person somewhere they have never been. She watched a child of about 8 reach out and touch the spine of a book with the tentative reverence of someone encountering something they have not met before, and she felt the fullness of that moment in her whole chest. She told David about it that evening, and he listened with the complete attention he brought to everything she said that mattered to her, and when she finished he said, "You're good at it." "At what?" "At making people feel that what they want is possible," he said. "You did it for me. The letters, even the ones that weren't entirely true, they showed me a woman who believed in the value of things. Books, knowledge, the work of understanding the world. I wanted to know that woman, and it turned out she was exactly who you are." She set down her mending and looked at him across the table, and the lamplight was between them, and James was asleep, and Rose was asleep, and the ranch was quiet, and she thought about where she had started and where she was now, and the distance between those 2 points felt both enormous and entirely traversable. "I was so afraid," she said. "Every day on that train I told myself I was doing the wrong thing and I should get off at the next stop and turn back." "What kept you on?" She thought about it honestly. "You," she said. "The you in the letters, the person who wrote about the second chair at the kitchen table and the mornings on the grassland and old Harlan Webb's wandering cattle. I thought if even half of that is real, it is worth the risk." It was all real, he said. I know that now, she said. I knew it then too, I think. That was the problem. It was very easy to fall in love with you from a distance. He looked at her. And from less of a distance, she smiled. Considerably easier, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had used in those early months, but with 3 years of history in it now, the weight of everything they had built and weathered and learned together. I fell in love with you, he said, somewhere around letter number 20, and then I kept falling for the next 32 letters and on the train platform and in the barn on the second morning when you talked to Moses for half an hour before you got on him. He paused. And every day since. Letter 20, she said. You wrote about watching the sun come up over the Cincinnati riverfront and thinking about what was on the other side of it, he said. You wrote that you had never been west of Ohio and that you thought about it sometimes, what it was like to have that much space in front of you. I read that and I thought, this person understands exactly what I came here for. She held his hand and thought about that letter, which she had written quickly and without much forethought on a Tuesday evening after a long day, just putting down what was in her head without the usual careful construction. The one truth she had told without meaning to, and it had been the one he had held on to. I almost didn't send that one, she said. I thought it was too much, too personal. Thank God you sent it, he said. The autumn of 1885 settled around them like a good coat, warm and solid, and the library grew by donations from people in the surrounding county who heard about it and dug books out of trunks and sent them, and by purchases that Lillian made carefully from a catalog she obtained from a bookseller in Kansas City. By the end of the year, it had more than 100 volumes and a regular circulation that included most of the town and a number of the outlying ranches. She ran it from the corner of Hector Mays's store, and she ran the ranch kitchen, and she raised James and Rose, and she tended the garden and the horses and the relationships of the community, and she wrote letters to Ruth in Tennessee and to Frances Briggs in Cincinnati and to Helen Cross, and she was not the woman she had described in her letters to David Barker in 1881 and 1882. She was better than that woman, because that woman had been constructed from fear and necessity, and this woman was constructed from the actual material of her life, which was real and sufficient and fully her own. On a November evening, late in 1885, with the first snow of the season coming down outside in that specific way of early snow that is more beautiful than serious, she and David sat on the covered porch in their coats and watched it fall. James was inside learning letters at the kitchen table, supervised by his father's patient instruction, and Rose was asleep. The world was white and quiet, and the barn light was a warm point in the dark. Tell me something, she said. What? Anything. Something you haven't told me yet. He thought about it. When I was 17, he said, I wanted to be a cartographer, map the territory. I read everything I could find about the surveys being done out west. She turned to look at him. You never told me that. It passed, he said. I ended up finding a different way to know the land. He looked at the snow coming down. But I think about it sometimes, the idea of making a map, making something exact out of something wild. Is that what you think about this? She said. What we've built here, he considered. Partly, he said. You can't map a life exactly, but you can know it. You can know its territory. He looked at her. I know yours. You do, she said, and you know mine. I think so, she said. I keep learning it, every day something new. That's the same as a good map, he said. It's never really finished. You just keep adding to it. She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the snow fall on the ranch that was theirs, on the corrals and the barn and the kitchen garden put to bed for the winter, and the road running out to Coldwater Creek, and the grassland rolling away beyond that under its new white covering. She thought about all the territory she had traversed to get here. The laundry, the boarding house, the 32 letters, the train crossing the plains, the platform in the afternoon heat, and the man with his hat in his hand saying, quietly and without cruelty, that he already knew. He already knew, and he had come anyway. He had come with an open hand and a patient heart and the particular kind of strength that does not need to announce itself, and he had stood there on that platform in Coldwater Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and made a place for her that was real and permanent and worth every mile she had traveled to reach it. The snow fell on. The house was warm behind them. Their children were inside in the lamplight, and she could hear James's voice asking a question in the careful way he asked questions, and she could hear David's voice in her memory answering, and she knew it was actually the echo of the man beside her, who had always answered her questions the same way, fully, honestly, with the patience of someone for whom truth was not a burden but a gift. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but it was always true, and she believed in saying true things. "I love you," he said, and his arm came around her and she settled into his side, and the snow continued its quiet, unhurried work of covering the world, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the life they had made together from two strangers and 32 letters, from lies and truths and train platforms and morning light on the Kansas grassland, was exactly as solid and as real as the ground beneath it. The second chair at the kitchen table was never empty again.